The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in October. I knew before I answered that it would change everything between my son and me forever. "Dad?" Mark's voice cracked through the receiver, and I could hear the echo of institutional walls behind him. "Dad, I need your help. I'm at the Dallas County Jail." I set down my reading glasses and closed the engineering journal I'd been browsing. At 70, my hands were steadier than my son's voice sounded right then. "I figured you might be calling," I said quietly. "Listen, Dad, there's been a huge misunderstanding. Someone reported me for something I didn't do. I need you to post bail. It's $25,000, but I can explain everything once I get out. This is all just a big mistake." The desperation in his voice reminded me of when he was 12 and had broken his mother's favorite vase. Same pleading tone, same assumption that Dad would fix everything without asking hard questions. But Martha had been gone for 8 months now, and I'd learned things about my only child that would have broken her heart. "Mark," I interrupted, my voice carrying the authority I'd used on construction sites across Texas for 45 years. "There's something you need to know." "What?" "Dad, can we talk about this later? I just need the bail money right now. You can take it from your IRA or get a loan against the house. Whatever's easiest. Even now, even from a jail cell." He was telling me how to spend my own money, son, I continued. Settling back in the leather recliner Martha had bought for my retirement, I was the one who called the police. The silence stretched between us like the distance between Dallas and Houston. I could almost hear his mind racing, trying to process what I'd just told him. That's not possible," he finally stammered. "You don't even know what they arrested me for." "Securities fraud, forged documents, identity theft, 3 counts of unauthorized access to financial accounts." I recited the charges like I was reading a blueprint specification. "Your mother always said you were smart, but she never said you were careful." The phone clattered on his end, and I heard him breathing heavily. When he spoke again, his voice had changed completely. Gone was the manipulative son trying to charm Dad into opening his wallet. This was a cornered man who'd finally realized the trap had closed. You called the federal authorities on your own son?" "I called them on a thief who happened to share my last name," I corrected. "There's a difference, though. I guess you never learned it." I'd practiced this conversation in my head for weeks, ever since I'd gathered enough evidence to make the case stick. The hardest part wasn't deciding to turn him in. It was accepting that the boy Martha and I had raised, the one we'd sacrificed for and believed in, had been systematically stealing from us for over 2 years. "Dad, please, you don't understand what you've done. I can pay it all back." "I was going to pay it all back." "With what money, Mark? You've been unemployed for 6 months. Your real estate license expired because you couldn't afford the renewal fees. The only income you've had came from my retirement accounts." The engineering part of my brain had mapped out his scheme like any other project. Variables, timelines, structural weaknesses. Once I started looking at the pattern instead of making excuses for my son, the fraud became obvious. 47 unauthorized withdrawals, forged signatures on 3 different financial institutions, a fake medical emergency that had cost me $18,000 from my health savings account. "I'm going to hang up now," I told him. "Your court appointment is scheduled for Friday morning. Suggest you use the time to think about what you want to say to the judge." "Dad, wait." I placed the receiver back in its cradle and walked to the kitchen window. Outside, the streetlights illuminated the quiet Highland Park neighborhood where Martha and I had raised our family. Same streets, same houses, but everything felt different now that I understood who my son really was. Tomorrow I'd call my attorney to finalize the changes to my will. The house, the savings, the small engineering consulting business I'd built. None of it would go to Mark anymore. I'd set up education funds for his children instead, managed by trustees who actually understood the value of honest work. At 70 years old, I'd finally learned that blood doesn't automatically earn respect. Sometimes the hardest lesson a father can teach his son is that actions have consequences, even when those consequences come from the people who love you most. Especially then. My grandfather, John Harlan, arrived in Galveston in 1952 with nothing but calloused hands and a letter from his cousin in Dallas. Irish immigrant, just like thousands of others chasing the promise of Texas oil and the American dream. He found work on drilling rigs, saved every penny, and by 1960 had bought a small house in what's now considered prime Dallas real estate. Dad followed Sean into construction, but he was smarter about it. Went to night school, learned engineering, specialized in bridge construction when Texas started expanding its highway system in the 70s. That's where I learned. My trade, summers spent watching him calculate load-bearing requirements and supervise concrete pours. Across the Trinity River, boy, he'd tell me while we ate lunch on steel, beams 200 feet above the water. This state rewards honest work. But you got to be smarter than honest. You got to be precise. I took that lesson to heart. Graduated from UT Arlington with a civil engineering degree in 1975. Married Martha 3 months later and landed a job with Henderson Construction Company. For the next 4 decades, I helped build the infrastructure that turned Dallas from a regional hub into a metropolitan powerhouse. Highways, office buildings, airport terminals. My signatures were on blueprints throughout North Texas. Martha and I bought the Highland Park house in 1978 for $48,000. 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch, 3 bedrooms, and a basement workshop where I could tinker with engineering projects. The mortgage payment felt enormous then, $260 a month. But Martha insisted we needed room to grow our family. Mark was born in 1980, and for 18 years that house was filled with Little League practices, homework sessions at the kitchen table, and birthday parties in the backyard. Martha planted roses along the fence line, and I built a treehouse that Mark used until he was too old to climb without embarrassing himself. The neighborhood was different then. Blue-collar families mostly, people who understood that success came from showing up every day and doing your job right. My next-door neighbor, Bill Thompson, worked for Texas Instruments. Across the street lived the Garcias. He was a Dallas firefighter. She taught elementary school. We'd barbecue together on weekends, share tools, help each other with home repairs. By 2010, the demographic had shifted. Tech money and financial sector wealth drove property values through the roof. Our $48,000 house was suddenly worth $800,000, then over $1 million. The Thompsons moved to Plano for cheaper living. The Garcias retired to their family ranch outside San Antonio. New neighbors arrived with BMWs and landscaping services, people who hired contractors for jobs I'd always done myself. I didn't mind the changes exactly. Martha and I had paid off the mortgage in 1995, and the increased property values meant our retirement nest egg was more secure than we'd ever imagined. My 401k from Henderson Construction, combined with Social Security and the consulting work I picked up after retiring, left us comfortable enough to travel and help Mark when he needed it. That's where I made my first mistake, assuming Mark needed help instead of recognizing that he wanted handouts. It started small. $1,000 here and there for business opportunities that never materialized. $5,000 to help with his down payment on a house in Addison. $10,000 when his real estate career hit a rough patch and he couldn't make his mortgage payments. Martha worried that we were enabling him, but I remembered my own father's pride in providing for family. John Harlan had worked double shifts to put my dad through night school. Dad had sacrificed weekends to ensure I could afford UT Arlington without crushing debt. Helping your children succeed, that was the American way. The Texas way. He's got to learn to stand on his own eventually, Martha would say when Mark called with another financial emergency. He will, I'd always reply. He just needs time to find his footing. But time kept passing, and Mark's footing never seemed to improve. His real estate license lapsed twice. He started multiple business ventures that folded within months. He married Amy, a woman whose primary talent seemed to be spending money they didn't have. And they had 2 children they couldn't afford to support properly. After Martha passed last February, heart attack, sudden and devastating, Mark's requests became more frequent and more urgent. Medical bills from her final hospitalization, he said. Legal fees for settling her estate. Emergency repairs on his house. Emergency car payments. Emergency everything. I was grieving, lonely, and desperate to maintain connection with my only child. Every check I wrote felt like buying another month of his attention. Another phone call. Another Sunday dinner with the grandkids. The Highland Park house felt enormous without Martha's laughter echoing through the rooms. Some evenings I'd sit in my workshop surrounded by 40 years of accumulated tools and half-finished projects, wondering if I'd outlived my usefulness. Mark's visits became the bright spots in an otherwise hollow routine. That's probably why it took me so long to notice that he'd started visiting when I wasn't home. Mark Anthony Harlan turned 45 last March, and I threw him a birthday barbecue in my backyard, like I had every year since Martha passed. Same routine. I'd fire up the old Weber grill, make my famous dry-rubbed brisket, and invite what was left of our family. His wife Amy would bring store-bought potato salad and complain about the Texas heat. The kids, Sarah and Michael, would run around the yard while the adults pretended everything was normal. But nothing about Mark was normal anymore, and I was finally starting to see it. He'd been a real estate agent for 15 years, working for various firms around the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Not a bad career choice in a state where property values kept climbing. Except Mark had a talent for picking the wrong clients and making the wrong deals. His license had lapsed twice for failure to complete continuing education requirements. Currently unemployed again, he claimed to be exploring new opportunities in property development. Amy was worse. Bleached blonde hair, designer handbags she couldn't afford, and a habit of photographing expensive restaurants for her Instagram while Mark borrowed money for their mortgage. She'd grown up in Highland Park money. Her father owned 3 car dealerships, but had been cut off years ago for reasons she never explained clearly. "Dad," Mark said that afternoon, lounging in one of Martha's old patio chairs while I tended the grill. "Amy and I have been talking about your situation here. My situation. Like being a 70-year-old widower living independently in his own home was some kind of problem requiring their intervention." "What situation is that?" I asked, flipping the brisket. "This house is way too big for one person. All these stairs, the maintenance, the property taxes. You're spending, what, $12,000 a year just on taxes? Plus utilities, insurance, upkeep?" He gestured broadly at the landscaping Martha and I had carefully cultivated over decades. "It's not practical anymore." Amy nodded enthusiastically from her lawn chair, where she was scrolling through her phone instead of watching her children. "There are some really nice senior communities in North Dallas. Active lifestyle, social opportunities, medical facilities nearby. Much more appropriate for someone your age, someone my age. I was 70, not 90. I still climbed ladders to clean gutters, maintained my own workshop, and drove myself anywhere I needed to go. But apparently my son and daughter-in-law had decided I was too decrepit to manage my own affairs. Been thinking about that myself. I lied smoothly. "What kind of timeline were you imagining?" Mark's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm I'd seen when he was 12, and thought he'd found a $20 bill on the sidewalk. "Well, the real estate market is hot right now. We could probably get 1.2, maybe 1.3 million for this place. After closing costs and realtor fees, you'd walk away with over $1 million in cash. And what would I do with that money?" "Invest it properly," Amy chimed in. "Mark has some connections in commercial real estate development. Much better returns than just letting it sit in savings accounts earning nothing." I almost laughed. Mark couldn't manage his own finances, but he wanted to invest my life savings in commercial real estate. The same Mark who'd lost $8,000 last year on a guaranteed cryptocurrency opportunity. "Plus," Mark continued, "think about the inheritance planning. If something happens to you, and I'm not saying it will, but, statistically, the estate taxes on a property this valuable could be enormous. Better to liquidate now while you can control the process." There it was. The real reason for their concern about my living situation. They weren't worried about my health or happiness. They were worried about their inheritance getting eaten up by taxes and legal fees. Over the next few months, their visits became more frequent and more focused. Mark would drop by unannounced, ostensibly to check on me, but I'd find him looking through mail on my kitchen counter or asking detailed questions about my retirement accounts. Amy started bringing real estate listings for senior communities, all conveniently located within driving distance of their house in Addison. "Dad, you've got to start thinking about the future," Mark said during one of these impromptu visits. "What if you fall down those stairs? What if you have a medical emergency and there's nobody around to help? What if you mind your own business?" I wanted to reply, but didn't. Martha had raised me to be polite, even when people didn't deserve it. Instead, I started paying closer attention to their behavior. Mark had a key to my house. I'd given it to him after Martha's funeral, in case of emergencies. But I began noticing small things moved or missing. My mail sorted differently than I'd left it. Papers on my desk rearranged. Once I found my filing cabinet unlocked when I was certain I'd secured it the night before. The final straw came in August, during another family barbecue. Sarah, my 10-year-old granddaughter, was playing in my workshop when she found Martha's jewelry box on my workbench. "Grandpa, why is Grandma's pretty necklace in here?" I looked where she was pointing. Martha's pearl necklace, the one I'd bought her for our 25th anniversary, was sitting next to my socket wrench set. I distinctly remembered putting that jewelry box in my bedroom closet after the funeral. "Sarah, honey, go ask your dad to come here for a minute." When Mark appeared, I held up the jewelry box. "Any idea how this ended up in my workshop?" His face went through several expressions before settling on defensive confusion. "Maybe you brought it down there and forgot. You know, grief can affect memory sometimes." That's when I knew. My own son was stealing from me, and he was insulting my intelligence while doing it. September in Texas feels like living inside an oven, but that didn't stop Mark from increasing his visits to twice a week. He'd show up during the hottest part of the afternoon, claiming concern about me handling the heat at my age, then spend an hour going through my house like he was conducting an inventory. "Dad, you really should consider getting one of those medical alert systems," he said during one particularly suffocating visit, while examining the contents of my desk drawer. "You know, the necklace thing where you can call for help if you fall." I was sitting in my recliner, watching him rifle through papers I'd organized the night before. "What makes you think I'm planning to fall?" "It's not about planning. It's about being prepared." Amy's been researching, and apparently 30% of people over 70 experience at least one serious fall per year. The insurance implications alone could be devastating. Insurance implications. Mark had never shown interest in insurance before, unless it involved filing claims for fender benders or mysterious water damage at his house. "Speaking of insurance," he continued, pulling out a folder I kept for important documents, "have you updated your health coverage since Mom passed? Medicare supplemental plans change every year. You could be missing out on significant benefits." What I was missing out on was privacy in my own home. Mark had appointed himself my unofficial financial advisor, despite the fact that his own checking account was regularly overdrawn. He'd bring official-looking papers for me to sign, claiming they were updates to my Medicare coverage or modifications to my homeowner's insurance. "Just needs your signature," he'd say, pointing to highlighted lines on documents I never had time to read thoroughly. "The deadline for enrollment is next week, and if you miss it, you'll be locked out until next year." I started keeping a small digital recorder in my shirt pocket during his visits. Old habits from my engineering days. Always document important conversations. The first recording was eye-opening. "Dad, I've been talking to a guy who specializes in estate planning for people in your situation," Mark's voice said through the tiny speaker as I played it back later. "He says there are ways to protect your assets from nursing home costs and estate taxes, but you have to act before there's a medical crisis." My situation. There was that phrase again. Like being a healthy 70-year-old with a paid-off house and comfortable retirement savings was some kind of emergency requiring immediate intervention. Estate planning specialist turned out to be Amy's brother-in-law, a guy who'd failed the bar exam twice and now sold insurance out of a strip mall office in Garland. He visited my house in early October, bringing a briefcase full of documents and a sales pitch about asset protection strategies. "Mr. Harlan," he explained, spreading papers across my kitchen table, "the current tax code is extremely unfavorable to people in your wealth bracket. But if we restructure your holdings correctly, we can minimize the government's ability to access your estate. The restructuring involved transferring ownership of my house and investment accounts to a family trust, with Mark as the primary trustee. For my own protection," he explained, "to ensure my assets would be available for my care while keeping them safe from potential creditors or medical expenses." "What creditors?" I asked. "I don't owe money to anyone." Well, you never know what might happen. Slip and fall lawsuits, medical malpractice claims, elder fraud schemes. People target seniors specifically because they assume you have money and won't fight back effectively. The irony wasn't lost on me. He was warning me about elder fraud while attempting to defraud me himself. I signed nothing, but pretended to consider their proposal. Meanwhile, I started documenting everything. The recorder captured conversations where Mark discussed my declining mental capacity and the urgent need to get financial matters settled before I became incompetent to make decisions. By November, their pressure had become relentless. Mark brought new papers every visit, each one designed to transfer more control over my finances to him. When I hesitated or asked too many questions, he'd invoke Martha's memory. "Mom would want you to be taken care of properly," he'd say. "She always worried about what would happen to you if something happened to her first." This is exactly what she would have wanted. Family, taking care of family. But Martha had left her own papers, including a journal she'd kept during her final months. I found it while cleaning out her closet, and her words were more revealing than Mark could have imagined. "I'm worried about Mark's financial situation," she'd written in January, just weeks before her death. "He keeps asking John for money, and John keeps giving it to him. But I've seen Mark looking through our mail when he thinks we're not watching. Yesterday I caught him photographing documents on John's desk with his phone. I don't think he's planning to pay any of this money back." Martha had known. She'd seen the same patterns I was finally recognizing, but she'd passed away before she could warn me properly. Her journal contained months of observations about Mark's behavior, Amy's spending habits, and their increasingly desperate attempts to access our savings. The last entry, dated 3 days before her heart attack, was the most damning. "I've hidden copies of all our important financial documents in the workshop toolbox. If something happens to me, John needs to know that Mark has been forging signatures on checks. I have pictures of the forged documents, but I don't know how to tell John without destroying their relationship." She tried to protect me even while she was dying. The least I could do was protect what we'd built together. The toolbox was exactly where Martha had said it would be, behind my workbench, under a dusty tarp I hadn't moved in months. Inside, wrapped in plastic bags, were photocopies of bank statements, canceled checks, and insurance documents that told a story I wasn't prepared to read. But I read it anyway, sitting in my workshop at 2 in the morning with a cup of coffee and Martha's reading glasses. The first forged check was dated 18 months ago, just after Martha's cancer diagnosis. $5,000 made out to cash, with my signature copied so expertly, I had to compare it to legitimate checks to spot the differences. The handwriting was Mark's. I recognized his distinctive way of forming the letter J, but he'd practiced my signature until it was nearly perfect. 47 checks total, ranging from $800 to $12,000. Always for amounts small enough not to trigger automatic bank reviews, but large enough to add up to something devastating. By my calculations, Mark had stolen over $200,000 from accounts Martha and I had spent 40 years building. But the checks were just the beginning. Martha had also documented a pattern of identity theft that made my hands shake as I read through her careful notes. Mark had been opening credit cards in my name, using my social security number and the Highland Park address to establish lines of credit I knew nothing about. 3 different bank accounts at institutions I'd never visited. A home equity loan against my house that I'd never applied for. The loan documentation was the most sophisticated part of his scheme. Someone had forged my signature on dozens of pages, including notarized documents that should have required my physical presence. But Mark had a friend who was a notary public. Amy's sister worked at a title company, and apparently family loyalty trumped legal requirements. Subject, Harlan HELOC application, read an email. Martha had printed from Mark's account, which she'd somehow accessed. "Thanks for processing this so quickly. Dad doesn't handle financial stress well since Mom's diagnosis, so we're trying to manage this quietly until she recovers. The funds will be used for her medical treatment." Medical treatment. He'd used Martha's cancer as cover for stealing $160,000 against the equity in our home. Money that was supposedly paying for her care was actually funding his lifestyle while she was fighting for her life. The email chain continued for months, with Mark providing forged documents and false medical bills to justify the loan. He'd even created fake invoices from cancer treatment centers, complete with letterhead and account numbers, to make the theft appear legitimate. But Martha had been thorough in her investigation. She'd called the treatment centers directly, confirming that none of the invoices were real. She'd contacted the banks, discovering that the loan proceeds had been deposited into accounts she'd never seen before. She'd even driven to the title company where the loan had been processed, taking pictures of the notarized documents with signatures that clearly weren't mine. The final folder contained the most damning evidence of all: IRS forms showing that Mark had been claiming me as a dependent for tax purposes, while simultaneously reporting income from financial accounts in my name. He'd essentially been living off my money while getting tax credits for supporting me. My workshop felt smaller as the scope of his betrayal became clear. This wasn't impulsive theft or desperate borrowing. This was a systematic, long-term scheme to drain every asset Martha and I had accumulated. The forged signatures showed months of practice. The fake medical bills required planning and coordination with accomplices. The tax fraud demonstrated a level of premeditation that transformed my son from a disappointment into a criminal. I spread the documents across my workbench like blueprints for a construction project, which in a way they were. Mark had been constructing an elaborate framework to steal my life's work, and he'd been building it while Martha was dying. The cruelest part was how he'd used our love against us. Every hospital visit, every family dinner, every worried conversation about Martha's prognosis had been an opportunity for him to gather information, forge documents, or manipulate our emotions to cover his tracks. Martha's final note was written in shaky handwriting, probably during one of her last lucid moments. I wanted to tell John everything, but I was afraid it would kill him. The stress might cause another heart attack, and I couldn't bear the thought of leaving him alone to deal with this. I've gathered all the evidence he'll need to prosecute Mark when I'm gone. I just pray he finds it before Mark takes everything we've worked for. She died protecting me from the truth about our son, but she'd also died knowing that I'd eventually have to face it alone. I sat in that workshop until sunrise, surrounded by evidence of Mark's betrayal and Martha's courage. She'd investigated our own child like a detective, documenting his crimes while battling cancer, because she knew I'd need proof when the time came to seek justice. The time had come. I gathered every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence Martha had collected, and placed them in a large manila envelope. Then I walked upstairs to my bedroom and pulled out the business card I'd kept in my wallet for 15 years. Robert Chen, FBI Financial Crimes Division, Dallas Field Office. Chen and I had worked together on a fraud case involving falsified engineering reports on a bridge project back in 2009. He'd told me then to call if I ever encountered financial crimes, especially those involving forged documents or identity theft. "Mr. Chen," I said when he answered his office phone at 7:30 that morning. "This is John Harlan. I need to report a crime." Robert Chen arrived at my house 3 hours after my phone call, bringing a younger agent named Sarah Martinez and a briefcase full of evidence bags. I'd worked with federal investigators before on construction fraud cases, but having them in my living room to discuss my own son felt surreal. "Mr. Harlan," Chen said, settling into Martha's old chair while Martinez set up a digital recorder. "Based on what you've described, we're looking at multiple federal crimes: identity theft, mail fraud, wire fraud, potentially racketeering if he's been coordinating with others. This is serious." I handed him Martha's manila envelope, watching his expression change as he examined the forged checks and loan documents. My wife documented everything before she passed. She was more thorough than most investigators. Martinez whistled softly as she reviewed the fake medical invoices. "These are sophisticated forgeries, professional quality letterhead, accurate account formatting. Your son either has serious skills or he's working with someone in the medical billing industry. Amy's cousin works for a medical billing company in Richardson," I offered. "Always seemed to have more money than her job should provide." Chen made notes while Martinez photographed each document with a high-resolution camera. The process took 2 hours, during which they explained the complexities of building a federal case that would actually result in conviction. The challenge with family fraud cases, Chen explained, is that defense attorneys will argue you gave permission for these transactions. They'll claim it was an informal family arrangement, that you were aware of the loans and transfers, but simply didn't keep good records. How do we prove otherwise? With the recordings you mentioned, and by documenting his current behavior. If he's still actively stealing from you, we can catch him in the act. But we need you to continue normal interactions while we build the case. That meant letting Mark keep visiting, keep pressuring me to sign documents, keep treating me like a senile old man who couldn't manage his own affairs. It meant recording conversations while pretending to be vulnerable, gathering evidence while my son continued to steal from me. How long will this take? I asked. 6 to 8 weeks for a solid case, Martinez replied. We'll need time to verify the document authenticity, trace the financial transfers, and coordinate with local law enforcement for the eventual arrest. My next call was to David Morrison, the attorney who'd handled Martha's estate planning. David had known our family for 20 years, which made explaining the situation particularly difficult. Jesus, John, he said after reviewing copies of the evidence. I prepared Mark's power of attorney documents 2 years ago. He told me you were developing memory problems and needed help managing your finances. What power of attorney documents? David's face went pale. He brought paperwork showing that you'd granted him limited power of attorney for medical and financial decisions. Said you'd signed them at your doctor's office but wanted me to review the language. Another layer of fraud. Mark had been planning this theft for years, establishing legal cover for his crimes by forging power of attorney documents that would give him legitimate access to my accounts. Do you still have copies of those documents? I asked. Of course. And now that I look at them more carefully, some of the formatting looks suspicious. The notary seal is slightly off-center, and the witness signatures. He examined the papers more closely. These are forgeries, aren't they? Apparently, my son is very talented. David immediately began working on new legal documents that would revoke any power of attorney Mark might claim to have, while also updating my will to remove him as beneficiary. We'll create a new trust structure that protects your assets while ensuring he can't challenge your mental competency later. The trust would be managed by David's law firm, with specific instructions that Mark and Amy were to receive nothing from my estate. My grandchildren would receive education funds, but only after reaching age 25, and only if they maintained good academic standing. Meanwhile, I had to continue playing the role of confused elderly father while my son escalated his theft. The hardest part was answering his phone calls with the same tone I'd used for 45 years, pretending I didn't know what he was doing. Dad, I've been thinking about what we discussed regarding the house sale, Mark said during one of these calls. The market is really hot right now, but that could change if interest rates go up. We should probably move quickly? I'm still considering it, I replied while Chen and Martinez listened from my kitchen, recording every word. What kind of timeline are you thinking? Well, I've already talked to a realtor friend of mine. She says we could have it on the market next week if you're ready to move forward. I've also found a really nice assisted living place in Plano. You could tour it this weekend. Assisted living. He'd progressed from suggesting senior communities to planning my institutionalization, probably because assisted living residents have less control over their own finances. That sounds reasonable, I said. Why don't you bring the paperwork by tomorrow afternoon? After I hung up, Chen shook his head. He's accelerating the timeline. That suggests he knows he's running out of time, or he's gotten desperate for a larger score. What happens tomorrow when he brings the paperwork? You stall. Ask questions. Request time to think about it. Maybe insist on having your attorney review everything. We need him to keep pushing, keep creating evidence of ongoing fraud, Martinez added. The more aggressive he gets, the stronger our case becomes. Right now, a defense attorney could argue these were old crimes, maybe even claim statute of limitations issues. But if he's actively trying to steal your house while we're building the case, that's current criminal activity. That night, I sat in my workshop surrounded by 40 years of accumulated tools and projects. knowing that everything I'd built was under attack by the person I'd trusted most. But for the first time since Martha's death, I felt like I was fighting back instead of just enduring. Tomorrow, Mark would arrive with paperwork designed to steal my home, and I'd be ready for him. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning, while Mark was sitting in my kitchen, trying to convince me to sign transfer documents for the house. Chen and Martinez had been parked down the street since dawn, waiting for my signal, a simple phone call to report a suspicious person on my property. Mark never saw it coming. One moment he was explaining how quickly we could close on the house sale. The next moment, federal agents were reading him his rights while neighbors gathered on their front porches to watch the spectacle. "This is insane," he kept repeating as they led him to the patrol car. "Dad, tell them this is a misunderstanding. Tell them you asked me to help with your finances." I stood on my front porch in the morning heat, watching my only child being arrested for crimes against me, and said nothing. What was there to say? That I'd spent 3 weeks documenting his ongoing theft? That Martha had died knowing her son was a criminal? That I'd rather see him in prison than let him steal everything we'd worked for? The phone call came that night at 11:47 p.m. Exactly, like I'd expected it would. "Dad." His voice sounded smaller through the jail's phone system, like he was calling from the bottom of a well. "Dad, I need your help. I'm at the Dallas County Jail." I settled into my recliner with a cup of coffee, preparing for the conversation I'd rehearsed in my head for weeks. "I figured you might be calling. Listen, Dad, there's been a huge misunderstanding. Someone reported me for something I didn't do. I need you to post bail. It's $25,000, but I can explain everything once I get out. This is all just a big mistake." The desperation in his voice was almost enough to make me feel sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered Martha's journal, the forged checks, the fake medical bills created while she was dying of cancer. "Mark," I interrupted, "there's something you need to know." "What?" "Dad, can we talk about this later? I just need the bail money right now. You can take it from your IRA or get a loan against the house, whatever's easiest." Even from jail, he was still telling me how to spend my own money, still assuming I'd mortgage my future to bail him out of trouble he'd created. "Son, I was the one who called the police." The silence stretched between us like the space between Dallas and Houston. I could hear him breathing, could almost feel his mind racing to process what I'd just told him. That's not possible," he finally stammered. "You don't even know what they arrested me for. Securities fraud, forged documents, identity theft, 3 counts of unauthorized access to financial accounts." I read the charges from the arrest report Chen had left with me. "Your mother always said you were smart, but she never said you were careful." The phone clattered on his end, followed by what sounded like him hyperventilating. When he spoke again, his voice had completely changed. Gone was the manipulative son trying to charm Dad into opening his wallet. This was a cornered animal who'd finally realized the trap had closed. You called the federal authorities on your own son?" "I called them on a thief who happened to share my last name. There's a difference, though I guess you never learned it." "Dad, please. You don't understand what you've done. I can pay it all back. I was going to pay it all back. The real estate market is recovering, and I had some deals lined up that would have covered everything." "With what money, Mark? You've been unemployed for 6 months. Your real estate license expired because you couldn't afford the renewal fees. The only income you've had came from my retirement accounts." I could hear him crying now, which might have moved me 6 months ago. But I'd cried too, sitting in my workshop at 2 in the morning, reading Martha's documentation of his betrayal while she was fighting cancer. "The home equity loan alone was $160,000, I continued. "You told the bank it was for your mother's medical treatment while she was dying. You used her cancer as an excuse to steal from us. I never meant for it to go this far." It started small, just a few thousand here and there when Amy and I were having problems. But then the market crashed and I lost some money on investments, and I thought I could fix everything before you noticed. Your mother noticed. She documented everything before she passed. Every forged check, every fake medical bill, every lie you told to cover up the theft. She spent her final months investigating our own son because she knew you were stealing from us." That broke something in him. The crying became sobbing, raw, and desperate in a way I hadn't heard since he was a child. "I'm sorry, Dad, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you or Mom. I just got in too deep and I didn't know how to get out without destroying everything." "You destroyed everything anyway, Mark. The difference is, now there are consequences." "What about the grandkids? What about Sarah and Michael? They don't deserve to have their father in prison. They deserve better than a father who steals from their grandfather. Amy will have to figure out how to support them honestly, assuming she wasn't part of this scheme." "She wasn't. Amy doesn't know about any of it. I kept all of this from her. I doubted that, given Amy's sudden interest in my estate planning and her brother-in-law's involvement in the forged trust documents. But that would be for the investigators to determine." "Dad, please, I'm begging you. Don't let them destroy my life over this. I'll sign anything you want. I'll never contact you again. Just don't let them send me to prison." "I'm going to hang up now," I told him. "Your court appointment is scheduled for Friday morning. I suggest you use the time to think about what you want to say to the judge." "Dad, wait." I placed the receiver back in its cradle and walked to the kitchen window. Outside, the streetlights illuminated the same Highland Park neighborhood where Martha and I had raised our family, where we'd believed we were preparing our son for an honest, productive life. The hardest lesson a father can teach his son is that actions have consequences, even when those consequences come from the people who love you most, especially then. The federal authorities' raid on Amy's house happened 3 days after Mark's arrest. I wasn't there to witness it, but the news footage showed agents carrying boxes of documents out of their Addison rental property while neighbors watched from across the street. Apparently, Mark's claims about keeping Amy uninformed were as false as everything else he'd told me. Chen called that afternoon with an update that surprised even him. "Your daughter-in-law had been running her own operation parallel to your son's scheme. Credit card fraud, identity theft targeting elderly clients from her previous real estate job, even a fake charity she'd established to collect donations for cancer research." "Cancer research?" "Called it the Martha Harlan Memorial Foundation. She'd been using your wife's name and story to solicit donations from people who knew your family. Collected over $40,000 in the past 6 months. My hands shook as I absorbed this information. Amy had turned Martha's death into a fundraising opportunity, exploiting the grief of friends and neighbors who genuinely wanted to honor her memory. It was a level of cruelty I hadn't imagined possible. What about the children? Child Protective Services has placed them with Amy's parents temporarily. Given the extent of both parents' criminal activity, they'll likely remain there permanently. Sarah and Michael would grow up knowing their parents were in federal prison for stealing from their grandfather. I felt sorry for them, but not sorry enough to let their parents escape justice. The investigation expanded rapidly once agents had access to Amy's records. Her cousin at the medical billing company had been creating fake invoices for multiple fraud schemes, not just mine. The notary who'd falsified my power of attorney documents had been forging signatures for years, helping Amy's brother-in-law steal from elderly clients. By Thursday, 7 people had been arrested in connection with what federal prosecutors were calling the Highland Park Elder Fraud Ring. Mark and Amy were the primary defendants, but the scope of their operations had involved half a dozen accomplices across Dallas County. The local news picked up the story Friday morning, just hours before Mark's arraignment. Channel 8 ran a segment titled, "Trusted Family Members Target Elderly Victims," featuring interviews with other families who'd been victimized by similar schemes. "This is unfortunately becoming more common," explained Detective Lisa Rodriguez from the Dallas Police Department's Elder Abuse Unit. "Adult children who view their parents' retirement savings as their own inheritance and who justify theft by claiming they're helping with financial management." My phone rang constantly that day. Neighbors wanting to know if I was okay, former colleagues expressing shock about Mark's arrest, and reporters hoping for interviews about the case. I answered none of them. This wasn't about publicity or sympathy. It was about justice. The arraignment was held in the federal courthouse downtown. in a courtroom I'd never expected to see from this perspective. I sat in the gallery watching Mark and Amy appear before Judge Patricia Williams, both wearing orange Dallas County Jail uniforms and looking smaller than I'd ever seen them. The defendants are charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, identity theft, mail fraud, and money laundering, announced Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Thompson. The government estimates the total financial damage at over $400,000, with victims including the defendants' own family members. $400,000. I'd known about the $200,000 they'd stolen from me, but apparently their criminal enterprise had been much larger. Other elderly victims had lost their savings to Mark's fake investment schemes and Amy's fraudulent charity work. When Judge Williams asked about bail, Thompson argued for detention. Your Honor, these defendants have demonstrated a pattern of sophisticated financial crimes targeting vulnerable elderly victims. Mr. Harlan used his position as a trusted family member to systematically defraud his own father, while Ms. Harlan established fake charities using the names of deceased relatives. Furthermore, Thompson continued, both defendants have significant financial incentives to flee. They've hidden assets in offshore accounts and have demonstrated a willingness to assume false identities for fraudulent purposes. The defense attorneys argued for reasonable bail, claiming their clients were pillars of the community with strong family ties. But Judge Williams had reviewed the evidence, including recordings of Mark pressuring me to sign over my house while he was actively stealing from my accounts. Bail is denied, she announced. These defendants will remain in federal custody pending trial. Mark turned to look at me then, his eyes pleading for some sign that I might still intervene on his behalf. I met his gaze steadily and shook my head once, definitively. Outside the courthouse, Chen explained what would happen next. With the evidence we have, they'll likely accept plea bargains rather than risk trial. Mark is looking at 10 to 15 years, Amy probably 8 to 12. The financial restitution will be substantial, though you'll never recover everything they took. What about the house? The forged loan documents? We've already contacted the bank. The home equity loan was obtained through fraud, so it's void. Your property is clear, and the bank will have to absorb the loss as part of the criminal case. That evening, I sat in my workshop reading Martha's journal one more time. Her final entry, written 3 days before she passed, included a line I'd missed before. I hope John is strong enough to do what's necessary when the time comes. Our son has chosen his path, and sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is let their child face the consequences of their choices. She'd known this day would come. She'd prepared me for it. Even while she was dying, Texas justice had prevailed, just like she'd believed it would. The plea hearing happened on a cold January morning, 8 months after Mark's arrest. Both he and Amy accepted the government's offer rather than face trial. Mark received 12 years in federal prison, Amy got 9. They'd also agreed to pay full restitution, though the prosecutors warned me that recovering money from convicted felons was often impossible. I sat in the same courthouse gallery, watching my son formally admit to crimes against me in front of a federal judge. When Judge Williams asked if he understood the consequences of his plea, Mark's voice was barely audible. Yes, Your Honor, I understand. Do you wish to make any statement before sentencing? Mark turned to look at me one final time. I just want to say that I'm sorry to my father and to my mother's memory. I dishonored everything they taught me, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends. Too little, too late. But at least he'd finally told the truth about something. After the hearing, David Morrison walked me through the paperwork that would reshape what remained of my family. The new trust structure protected my assets while establishing education funds for Sarah and Michael, now living permanently with Amy's parents in Richardson. The children will receive funds for college tuition and living expenses, David explained, but only if they maintain good grades and stay out of legal trouble. The trust includes provisions for counseling and therapy, given what they've been through. I'd also established a small annual allowance for their basic needs, clothing, school supplies, medical expenses their grandparents couldn't afford. The money would be managed by David's firm, ensuring Amy's parents couldn't access it for other purposes. but guaranteeing the children wouldn't suffer for their parents' crimes. What about visits? David asked, "Do you want to maintain contact with your grandchildren?" I'd wrestled with that question for months. Sarah and Michael had lost both parents to federal prison because of my decision to prosecute. They'd grow up knowing their grandfather had chosen justice over family loyalty. Would they understand that choice, or would they resent me for destroying their family? I'll leave that up to them, I decided. When they're old enough to understand what happened and why, they can decide whether they want a relationship with me. The house felt different after the legal proceedings ended. Quieter, but not necessarily lonely. I'd started volunteering at the Highland Park Community Center, teaching basic engineering principles to high school students interested in construction careers. The work reminded me why I'd loved my profession, building things that would last, solving problems that mattered. My neighbor, Bill Thompson, had moved back from Plano after his wife passed, and we'd rekindled our friendship over weekend barbecues and Dallas Cowboys games. He'd been through his own family struggles, a daughter who'd stolen from him during his wife's illness, and understood the particular pain of being betrayed by your own child. "You did the right thing," he told me one Sunday afternoon as we sat on my porch watching grandchildren from other families play in the street. Sometimes being a good parent means being willing to be the bad guy. Doesn't feel good, though. It's not supposed to. That's how you know you're still human. The financial recovery had been better than expected. Between the restitution payments and the voided home equity loan, I'd recovered about 60% of what Mark and Amy had stolen. The insurance company had also paid claims for the identity theft, and the bank had absorbed the losses from the forged loan documents. More importantly, I'd regained control over my own life. No more unexpected visits from Mark. No more pressure to sign papers I didn't understand. No more pretending to be a confused old man who needed his son's help managing basic affairs. At 71, I was more financially secure and emotionally stable than I'd been since Martha's death. I'd even started dating again. Though dating at my age mostly meant having coffee with Margaret Chen, Robert's aunt, who'd moved to Dallas after retiring from teaching in Houston. She was a widow herself, understood grief and betrayal, and didn't expect me to pretend that losing my son to federal prison wasn't a daily source of pain. You can miss someone and still be glad they're facing consequences. She told me during one of our walks through Reverchon Park, those feelings don't contradict each other. The hardest part was holidays. Thanksgiving and Christmas had always been family time, with Mark and Amy bringing the grandchildren over for dinner and gift exchanges. This year, I'd spent both holidays volunteering at the community center, serving meals to families who couldn't afford their own celebrations. It was there I met Rosa Martinez, a single mother whose ex-husband had stolen her savings and disappeared, leaving her to raise 3 children alone. Her story reminded me that family betrayal wasn't unique to my situation. It was a common human tragedy that crossed all social and economic boundaries. How do you trust anyone after something like that? She asked me while we cleaned up after Christmas dinner service. "You start small," I replied, thinking of Margaret and Bill and the other people who'd become my chosen family. "You trust people who earn it day by day, instead of trusting them because you're supposed to." Spring brought news that Mark had been transferred to a federal prison in Oklahoma, where he'd served most of his sentence. Amy had been sent to a facility in Arkansas. They'd likely be released in their 50s, middle-aged ex-convicts with federal felony records and no legitimate job prospects. Part of me felt sorry for them. Part of me wondered if I'd been too harsh, if there might have been another way to handle the situation that didn't end with my son in prison. But then I'd remember Martha's journal, her careful documentation of their betrayal while she was dying of cancer. And I'd know I'd made the only choice that honored her memory and protected everything we'd built together. Justice had been served. The family had been rebuilt on a foundation of truth instead of manipulation. For the first time in over a year, that felt like enough. 2 years after Mark's sentencing, I received a letter forwarded through David Morrison's law office. The return address showed Federal Correctional Institution, El Reno, Oklahoma. Mark's handwriting had changed during his incarceration. Smaller, more careful, like he was conserving ink or space. "Dad," it began, "I know I don't have the right to contact you after what I did, but I wanted you to know that I'm in a program here that helps inmates understand the impact of financial crimes on victims. I've written this letter dozens of times and thrown it away, because nothing I say can undo the damage I caused." He went on to describe his daily routine, working in the prison library, taking correspondence courses in accounting ethics, participating in group therapy sessions with other white-collar criminals. He'd learned that Amy had been released early for cooperation with other fraud investigations, had moved to Arkansas to live with distant relatives, and was working as a cashier at a grocery store. "I think about Mom every day," the letter continued, "about how she died knowing what I was doing, and how I used her illness to justify stealing from you. There's no forgiveness for that, and I'm not asking for any. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I threw away, and why you had to stop me." The letter concluded with news about Sarah and Michael. They were doing well in school, had joined the debate team and soccer team respectively, and rarely asked about their parents. Amy's parents had told them their mother and father were away working and would explain the truth when they were older. "They're good kids," Mark wrote. "Better than their parents deserved. Thank you for making sure they'll have opportunities I would have destroyed." I read the letter twice, then filed it in my desk drawer without responding. What was there to say? That I forgave him? I wasn't sure I did, or if forgiveness was even relevant anymore. That I missed him? I missed the son I'd thought he was, not the criminal he'd revealed himself to be. That evening, Margaret and I sat on my back porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and gold. She'd become a permanent fixture in my life, though we maintained separate households and independent routines. At our age, companionship mattered more than passion, and shared understanding trumped romantic gestures. "You're quiet tonight," she observed, sipping the sweet tea she'd taught me to make properly. "Got a letter from Mark." She nodded without asking for details. Margaret understood the complexity of loving someone you could never trust again, the particular grief of losing a child to their own choices, rather than to illness or accident. "Any regrets?" she asked eventually. I considered the question seriously. Did I regret prosecuting my own son? Did I regret choosing justice over family loyalty? Did I regret the destruction of relationships that had sustained me for 45 years? "I regret that it was necessary," I said finally. "I regret that Martha died knowing what he was doing. I regret that my grandchildren will grow up with parents in prison. But I don't regret stopping him." The truth was, Mark's imprisonment had freed me to rebuild my life on honest foundations. The house was truly mine again, not a target for manipulation. My retirement savings were secure, protected by legal structures he couldn't circumvent. Most importantly, I'd proven to myself that age hadn't made me vulnerable. It had made me wiser about recognizing threats and responding appropriately. The Highland Park neighborhood had changed again in the 2 years since Mark's arrest. Young families had moved into houses previously owned by retirees, bringing children's laughter back to streets that had grown too quiet. I'd become the unofficial grandfather to several of these families, teaching kids how to use tools safely and helping their parents with home repair projects. Mr. Harlan, 8-year-old Jake from next door, had asked me last week, "How come you know how to fix everything?" "Because when I was your age, people expected you to learn how things worked," I'd replied, showing him how to properly hold a screwdriver. "We didn't throw things away when they broke. We figured out how to make them work again." It was a lesson that applied to more than just household repairs. When my family broke, I'd figured out how to make my life work again, even if it meant cutting away the damaged parts that couldn't be salvaged. The engineering principle of load-bearing capacity applied to human relationships too. Every structure has limits, and when those limits are exceeded, failure becomes inevitable. The question isn't whether to prevent the failure, it's whether to control the collapse to minimize damage to the overall system. I'd controlled the collapse. The justice system had removed the threats. The lawyers had protected the assets. The family structure had been rebuilt with stronger materials and better foundations. As Margaret and I finished our tea and prepared to go inside, I thought about the lesson this experience had taught me about the American dream It wasn't just about building wealth or achieving success. It was about protecting what you'd earned from people who wanted to take it without working for it themselves. Mark had believed he was entitled to my life's work simply because he was my son. Amy had thought Martha's death was an opportunity to profit from others' grief. They'd both learned that entitlement without effort leads to federal prison, and that family connections don't override the rule of law. The real American dream, the one my grandfather, Sean, had pursued when he came to Texas in 1952, was about taking responsibility for your choices and accepting the consequences of your actions. Mark had made his choices. I'd made mine. The difference was I could live with the results. Tomorrow, I'd wake up in the house Martha and I had paid for with honest work. I'd drink coffee from cups we'd bought with legitimately earned money. I'd tend the garden she'd planted with her own hands, in soil that belonged to us free and clear. And if Mark's children ever wanted to understand why their grandfather chose justice over family loyalty, I'd tell them the same thing I'd tell anyone facing similar betrayal. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive behavior, even when that someone shares your blood, especially then.